Hello, everyone. Welcome back to another lecture in our Java series. Today, we are going to continue on with the topic of Java arrays, which we started to cover in our last lecture. But as I mentioned then, there are a lot to Java arrays, and we're pretty much going to cover your standard everyday use cases of working with Java arrays and show you what you can do within your existing program code. So let's hop in. So we've briefly covered what arrays are, but what can you actually do with arrays once you know what they are? So arrays are not just for storing values. You can use arrays to process the values that are within them. So doing a brief array recap, pretty much we know that your arrays are going to hold various values of the same type and they have indexes. So the elements in the arrays can be accessed or modified to allow you to use them within your code in some way. Now, keeping that in mind, we're going to shift into loops with arrays. So loops can be used to allow you to pretty much check out, visit, use each element that's in the array one at a time. So when you use loops, you can do things like printing the values, you can do different math calculations with values, searching for particular things, or even counting the items that are in your array. So when we are looking at loops with arrays, typically you are going to be using your for loops. Now, the for loops work exactly how for loops work when I discussed them in the lectures before this, but the difference is your loop is going to take into consideration the length of the array, and that is how it knows how many times to run the loop. So your loop will basically continue as long as your index or the loop iterator I is less than what that array length is. So that's basically how it works. Basically the same use case as a normal for loop, except your loop runs based on the length of your array. Now, again, there's different uses of loops when working with arrays, but one of those examples is printing out your array elements one by one. In this case, if you take a look, there's nothing too different about this for loop other than the array is used with its length. So nums dot length is used, and that tells it how many times to run the loop, and pretty much it runs it 3 times because there are 3 items in the array. And pretty much all it's saying in this case is to simply print out the index or the element at the index of that array. So one by one, it will consider what the index is. The first time your loop runs, your index I is equal to 0. That means the first time your loop is ran, it will immediately print out to you what the value of nums 0 is, which in this case is 5. Then your loop will increment. It will then go to I equals 1, so it will print nums 1, which is 10, and then it would print nums 2, which is 15. And that is how printing out an array works. So pretty much on the same line of how this loop is running for printing, it can be used the same way to do different things inside of that for loop body. For example, you can use it to do calculations. So again, remember that this for loop is going to go through each element in the array and it's going to do whatever you say with that element inside of the for loop body. In this case, we're simply saying that we want to do a summary of the number of elements in the array. So this is just finding the overall sum of different numbers that are in an array. So one by one, they're going to access each element, and then they're going to add that value of the element to sum. So basically what's happening here is the loop will first add 5 to sum, then it will add 10 to sum, then it would add 15 to sum, then it will add 20 to sum. Each time the value is added, it changes the value of the sum. So at the end, your sum is going to be equal to 50 because it pretty much took every element of your array and added them to the value of sum. So this is an example of how your for loop can be used to do calculations. Again, you can do other calculations like division, multiplication, subtraction, whatever you would like to do inside of the for loop, but this is just showing you how you can use your arrays or your number arrays for calculation purposes. You can also use your loops and arrays when you want to, let's say, match a condition and count how many times that occurs. So if you want to see how many times the elements of an array satisfy a specific rule. In this example you see on the screen, we're counting how many even numbers are actually in this array. So if you take a look, in our for loop, nothing changes. We're pretty much still doing our usual for loop. We're going for the length of the array, but inside of our for loop, we're using a conditional or an if statement that's allowing us to check to see if the current element that we are on reaches a or meets a specific condition. And if it meets a specific condition, then it does this action. So in this case, this is showing us if we are going to count the number of even numbers in the array. Now, again, there could be any set of conditions that is being tested inside of this for loop, but this is just showing you one use case. So there may be another use case where you want to see if some elements are a certain letter or some elements a certain number, etc., etc. So there are different conditions you can use, but this is just a brief example showing you what that means and how you could apply this within your code. So again, using for loops and arrays also may take some consideration strategy to properly execute, but overall there are a lot of different outcomes that you can have if you use your arrays and loops properly. Another thing you can do is do a linear search of an array. So that would just check if the element is in your array. So if you're looking for one specific element in an array. So in this example, we have a array of numbers, and we're going to say that we're looking for the number 2 in this array. So basically what your loop is doing is it's going to have that conditional to see if one of the elements in the loop is going to equal that target or 2. So again, it would check one by one to see if that element is equal to the target element. And then if it finds it, it would do one thing. If it doesn't, then in this case, it will do return back -1. So in this case, or this example, -1 would display if 2 was not in the nums array. In this case it is, so we would not see -1 as a response, but that's basically what's going on. So if the element I is going to be equal to whatever that element is at target, then it would change the value, and pretty much it would print it out to the user that this is the actual index that element is at. So it's basically going to output the position of the element if it is in the array. If it is not, it will say -1, which means not found. So this is basically what's going on. So if that's a little confusing, I do recommend that you pause right here, kind of take a look at this code, and read line by line to understand fully what's going on. But that's kind of the idea of a linear search. It's just going to go one by one to find a specific target in the array. Now, when would you use a linear search? Typically, you would do it if you have like small or medium arrays. If there's a gigantic array, you would not want to use it in that case. Let's say, for example, like 100+ different elements. You wouldn't want to do it like that. Um, or you could even use it when an array is not sorted. So if you're trying to find something, then you could use it there. Or if you want to know if a value exists, you can use it that way. So there are different use cases for linear search. These are just some examples of how you could use it in your code. So we talked about the for loop, but we're also going to talk about the enhanced for loop in this case for each, and this is one that is commonly used with your arrays. Now, the for each is going to allow you to loop through all of the elements without having to worry about the index. So you see our for loop here is not using an I equals 0, I plus plus, I is less than, array length. It's not using any of that. So it's basically sort of simplifying your for loop for you. And in this case, all you would have to do is provide the array type followed by the variable and then the array name. So what is the data type that you're looking for? And what is that variable name going to be used that you are looking for that is going to be in that array? So basically be like a for this in this array sort of situation. So if we take a look at this example, you see we have a array called nums holding various numbers, and our for each loop is basically saying for each integer value in nums, we want to do this. And in this case, we're just saying we want to print out the value. So that is basically the simplified way of using a for loop with arrays. For this item in this array. That's basically what is going on. So if you want to save yourself time, this is a useful loop to use, the for each loop. So now that we've covered our loops with arrays, we're actually going to get into the arrays class. Yes, there is technically a class of arrays that already exists in Java, but I had to show you how to create arrays manually yourself without having to worry about using the class or importing it and things of that nature. But now we will take a look at it. So the arrays class is basically a built-in class in the Java util that provides you different methods you can use when you're working with your arrays. So yes, you must import this similar to how you import the scanners. And it does have some built-in methods to it that you can use. And these are some common ones, which we are going to briefly cover. But as you see, there is toString, a sort method, copy method, and an equals method, for example, that you can use, again, that are already pre-made for you out there in your IDE environments. Now, the first one we're going to talk about is the toString. It literally sounds exactly like what it's saying. It's going to convert the array into a string, and it's printing it out as a string value instead of a array. So in this case, it will simply print out exactly what is in the array, but in the data type of a string. Now, take note of how this method is being called. You literally have to say arrays.toString followed by the array name. You cannot just say toString in the array name. You have to say arrays.toString, exactly how you see it on the screen. In this example, you see in the print statement, it says arrays.toString nums, and nums is the example array in this example. So you do have to use the methods like this. So this counts for all of the other methods we're going to cover as well. So the next one we have is to the arrays.sort. So obviously this is going to sort your array, but it is going to sort it in ascending order. That means it's going to sort it from A to Z or 1 to whatever in order. In this example code, we have the nums array again, and that next line we have arrays.sort nums. That basically is going to change the array and rearrange the placement of the elements, meaning it will go from smallest to largest. And that last line, we're basically saying that we want to print it out using the string method. So that is just an example of actually using two different array methods from the arrays class and code. And that would be the output. So again, remember that sorting is going to change the original array. So another method you have is the copy of method. This is going to be used when you want to copy or create a new array with a specified length. So taking a look at this code, we see we have that nums array again with 3, 6, and 9. So it has a length of 3 currently. The next array we have is an array called bigger, and it's going to use that copy of method, and it's basically going to take whatever is in nums, and then it's going to increase that size to 5. So it will increase it from 3 to 5 elements. Now, being that we did not specify the other 2 elements that would be added, it gives it a default value, which in this case is 0. So if you take a look at the output, that is what the new array of bigger would hold. It has the original elements of nums, and it added on the 2 default values of 0 to make up that extra in length. Of course, once you do this, you can always go in and manually change those zeros to another value, but this is basically what will happen if you use this method. And lastly, we have your equals method, and this is literally going to see if a array is equal to another array. Now, when it comes to this, the arrays can have the same elements, but if they are not in the same order, they do not equal. So for this case, they must have the same elements in the same order to be equal to each other. That means if, for example, array A has 1, 2, and 3, but array B has 2, 1, and 3, those two arrays are not equal. Both must have the same elements in the same order for this equals method to be true. So the equals is going to return back to you true or false, whether the array is the exact same or not. So that is one thing I do want to point out. So please keep that in mind if you ever use the equals method. All right. So now that we covered some array class methods, some common things you can do, there is another thing that you can do with your arrays. So copying. So yes, we did cover that copying method, but there's other ways that arrays can be copied or ways that you believe can be copied, but I just want to mention this important note to you on that. So arrays are what you would consider an object, and variables store references, not the array itself. So let me explain this further. So let's say you want to copy an array to another array. You might simply think that you can go ahead and just create a empty array and assign it the other array to copy it. So in this example, you see we have a array called A and an array called B. A has the three number values, 1, 2, and 3. Now for B, we're saying we want to create a new array called B, and in our head, we're thinking if we assign it A, then B will then hold 1, 2, and 3. Now, technically, yes, that is the case. However, it is not actually a copy of the A array. It's basically saying that A and B are pointing to the same array in memory, which is basically saying A and B are both pointing to A. Although B is its own array, it is technically pointing back to the A array. So changing one will change the other. It's basically connecting them, but it's not copying them. So if you take a look at this example, if we were to say, for example, that we want to change the index of the element at the index 0 of A to 99, and then we want to say we're going to print out the value of array B, the output would be 99, 2, and 3. Although we did not specify in our code that we are saying B0 equals 99, because you used the array how you did by assigning B to A, that reference back to A. That means B is just pointing back to A. It is not its own array. So if A changes, B automatically changes. And that is what is a reference copy. It's not a real copy, it's a reference copy of one array. So to avoid this problem, you can do a manual copy, which means you would have to create an entirely new array and copy each element individually using a for loop. So in this example, you see we create a new array of integer B, or so array called B, that is taking the same length of A. And in the for loop, we are going to use the A's length to then place in the contents of A into B. So that's basically all that's happening in the for loop. It's saying for each index, we're going to make sure that the index value of 0 for B and A is 1. The index value for B, or the index value of 2 for B and A is 3. So that's the example of that. It's just basically copying each index one at a time to the B integer, or the B array, excuse me. So this is a manual copy if you do not use, of course, your arrays.copy of method. So I recommend using the arrays copy of method, but again, you could use the manual way as well. But I just wanted to point that out, as some times when you are first starting off and working with arrays, you may think that that reference copy example will work, and it does not. So just wanted to point that out to you all. Okay, now that we've covered your common use cases, I'm going to now tie this back to our OOP topics. So our classes, our objects, and our methods. But first, let's get into methods. So yes, you can technically pass an array into a method and use it inside of the method. But again, when you're using this array in the method, it is using a reference to the array. So it is not a copy. So that means the method can change the original array. So here's an example of that. You see we have a method called printArray that will accept an array of an integer into the method. And there is a for loop in that method that will then go through that passed array. So in this example, ARR is the passed array. It will go through the array ARR, get the index or the element at that index, and print it out to the user. And that's basically what will happen here. So you're literally going to pass in the reference to that actual array. So in this case, when we run the method, you see we are using the nums array at the bottom, and we're calling the method print array nums. So we'll pass in nums and one by one access each element and print it out to the user. So that's an example of how you could technically pass an array into a method. Another thing you can do is use a method to modify the array. So same way you can pass in the array and then you can state, I want this index of the array to be this value. And you can see that in this make first zero method example. We're basically changing the index at position 0 of the past array. So that is another way you can use it. So you can either use it to do some sort of calculation, functioning, usage of an array, or even modifying an array. So yes, you can pass arrays into methods. Now, being that you can use them in methods, obviously you can also use them in objects. So arrays can store objects, not just your primitive data types. So it's not just going to be storing your integers and things of that nature, because you can store a string in an array. So each element that is going to be used is a reference to an object. So you can use arrays on custom objects that you create. But when you create an array for a custom object, it's going to be empty. So let's say you have an object or a class you have created. You want to create an array that holds various objects of this class. You can technically do that. However, when you very first starting off that array of custom objects, it's going to be an empty array until you create the objects themselves and assign them in the array. And that will make sense in this example here. So in this example here, each element of your array is going to be a reference to a student object. So if you take a look, the very first line of code is basically creating an array of data type or type student, which is going to be our class. So we're basically saying we want to create an array of student objects from the student class. We're going to name this array roster, and roster is then going to hold 3 student objects. Now, that first line is creating the array, but that array in itself is empty. There's nothing in it, it's just null, completely empty. It does not have the values in the array until you assign or create the objects, which we are doing with the actual array in its index position. So if you see here, we're then using our array name, which is roster, and we're specifying where each object is going to go inside of that array. So at the first position of roster, we want a new student called Ava, and this is her information. At the second position of roster, we want another student named Liam, and so on and so forth. So it does not have anything in the custom objects array until you assign the new object to the specified index, like this example. So yes, you can do it, but you have to remember how to use it properly. So with that being said, again, I told you there's a lot of ways you can use arrays. A lot of ways. Again, technically, you can spend a month on arrays alone learning. But we are just covering your common basic use cases of arrays to get you started with using and storing data in your programs. So I will stop it here as far as getting into arrays because, again, technically, this is completed in a deep dive in like a data structures course or something of that nature. But arrays is how you start to get your feet wet in that world of data structures within your code. So just keep in mind what I'm covering is just common usages and things that may be beneficial to you as you're starting to learn how to code in Java. So overall, today we covered how to use loops with arrays. We also covered the built-in arrays class. We covered how you can copy arrays, and we also covered how arrays can be used in OOP with your methods and your objects and the classes that you create. So overall, over these two lectures, you have seen the various things you can do with arrays. Again, there's a lot more than I have covered here, but you see that there's a lot of opportunities for you when you are working with arrays. So yes, now that we are working with arrays, this topic is a little tricky. It is detailed. This is a longer lecture, but this is a very important topic to help you learn how to store data and work with more data in your code and your Java programs moving forward. So I do highly recommend that if there's something you did not fully understand, you can rewind, take some time to read through the code or the example, and even do research further, of course, which is always recommended. But the goal is basically for you to fully understand the usage of arrays, how you can use them to make your code more useful, reusable, and efficient. So, thank you for sitting through this longer lecture. We are going to also do a coding tutorial covering some of the things we have shared in this lecture here today. So, stick with me, and I hope to see you in that coding tutorial coming up next.